Gus Skoog, a boat builder of Vinalhaven, Maine, was copied from my Super 8 movie taken in 1975 at Gus Skoog's shop on Vinalhaven Island. It documents the story of a one-man boat building and is perhaps the only record of post-World War II wooden boat building along the Maine coast. After watching Gus Skoog build many boats on the island of Vinalhaven, I decided that a record should be kept of a one-man boat shop. So, over a period of 5 months, I filmed this 80-year-old boat builder as he built this 34-foot lobster boat. Lofting is a process that you transfer the lines from a drawing or the naval engineering paper onto either a piece of paper or a piece of wood. Gus doesn't use this system. He builds or makes a half model that you see here. It takes him about 2 weeks to make one. And after he has built it and shaped it to exactly what he wants, he uses that for the lofting process. If you look closely on this half model, you will see lines going up and down. That is where the molds or the forms will be. On the big boat. Here he takes a piece of lead and he wraps it around the boat at the point where the lines are. That shapes very easily. Then he positions the piece of lead onto a piece of 8.5 by 11 paper, graph paper, and he traces that piece of lead. That is the small size of the molds or the forms that will be used on the boat. See, the lead corresponds to the black line that he has drawn onto it. He does that for every single place on the half model where there is a black line. He does not have any drawings made up beforehand. It is strictly by eye as to what he decides the boat should be. He then transfers the lines from the 8.5 by 11 paper to a 4 by 8 piece of plywood. This is full size. And from those lines there, he will transfer that to a piece of wood which eventually form or become the forms or the molds that are used in building the boat. Those black lines are the different parts of the boat. There you see Gus holding up the form or the mold of the boat. That will form the ribs on the inside. He will position it inside on the keel, and that forms the shape of the boat. The actual building started on April 1st, 1975. Here he is using a peavey to move a slab of oak. It is green oak, white oak. And what he does is move it over so he can work on it. He, generally speaking, uses green wood, either oak or cedar for the planking. It is a lot easier to work onto. This oak is 4.5 inches thick. Here, a friend of mine happens to be with me on the time that I went to the island, and he is helping him. Gus would do it by himself. It is no problem. That is the peavey, which you normally see when they're cutting wood on the logs. Gus has made a template out of plywood of the stem, which is up in the bow, and also the forefoot. He places them on top of this slab of oak and will trace them, and he will eventually cut them out. Now the forefoot. In a boat's construction, where the stem or the bow meets the keel, there is a wedge called the forefoot on the inside, which holds the two together. Four-and-a-half-inch thick oak, green. See that darker color in the center. Now the keel stock is 4.5 inches thick also. This is a dragger coming in. It is an island, a fishing island, and lobstering. Here Gus rolls in the oak slab on top of rolls, and he can do it very easily with the peavey. As I say, my friend is there at the time. Otherwise, he's there by himself like this, rolling in the stock into the boat shop. This is for the keel. And since the boat is 34 feet long, the keel is over 30 feet long. Now the rabbet is where the planking fits into the keel. Here Gus uses a saw to cut out the rabbet, which is most unusual. And that is the groove in the side of the keel where the planking will fit. It's a very powerful saw, and he has had it repaired many times over the years since he has built over 100 boats. His wood cutting is so accurate that he can actually lift the piece of wood out. Now he takes his chisel, which is 1 inch wide, and puts it against the wood to make sure that the cut was 1 inch deep, because the planking is going to be 1 inch. Here he uses a gouge to widen that rabbet where it is needed. Again, the wood is dark as he gets into it because it is green. He is now using an adze to smooth that off. He is left-handed, so basically his right hand just holds it steady, and with the left hand he is moving the adze down. It is a tool that it's a very hard tool to use. It takes a lot of practice, but he can shave it off just like using a plane. Those chips come off just as smooth as can be. He cannot go too deep. He can't go too shallow. He has worn out 2 adzes in the process of building 100 boats. This is probably the most skilled aspect of boat building, use of the adze. Just taking a light chip off. Then he uses an electric sander to smooth the cut off that he has done with the adze. Gus uses a lot of hand tools, but he also uses electric tools at the right time. But there are some places where he has to use a hand tool to get done what he wants to. There is the adze set up. I have been asked, what is that point on the other end? Well, it could have been used in the logging process if you had to move a log. Notice that this adze, a boat builder's adze, has a little lip on the side. A carpenter's adze does not have that lip on the side. The handle is bent so that he can get more force. It's made that way. The adze is resting on top of the keel. Gus has already cut out the stem, and he has cut the groove in there for the planking. The rabbit, he has now positioned it over the keel, and there is the forefoot that you saw him lay out before. He is going to put them together, the stem, the forefoot, and the keel together, just to see how they fit. A trial run. This is the bow of the boat. Now in the rabbit that you saw him cut, he has to cut out notches that the ribs of the boat fit into. And he measures along the rabbit. Each rib is on a 9-inch center, so Gus has marked off 9 inches on center, and he uses a piece of 1-inch stock, which is what the ribs will be, and lays out the notch that he has to put in. He does that the whole length of the rabbit. There will be 86 ribs on this boat on 9-inch centers. Now Gus is cutting out the notch for the ribs. He uses a saber saw. He cuts down on the lines that he has drawn, and then he will use a chisel and knock that out. And that slot is where the rib is going to fit into the keel. The notch is very important. It cannot be too deep. It can't be too shallow. If it's too deep, then the rib will fit down inside below the surface. Whereas if it's too shallow, it will stick over the surface. So Gus takes a piece of wood and tries it to make sure that the notch is exactly right. Now that on his right hand, that would be the rib if it were put in. Again, he uses the saber saw to cut where he has made a line for the notch for the ribs. That's the saber saw there. In other words, there will be 43 notches on each side of the keel, making a total of 86 ribs. You are now looking at one side of the keel with the notches in the rabbit. As I say, the rabbit is where the first plank fits onto the keel. This is the stern post of the boat. Gus is going to clamp the forefoot temporarily to see how they fit, and then he will put the stem on. He wants to make sure it is a tight fit. Now he has the stem in position, and as you can see, it is a very good fit. I don't think you can even put a piece of paper between each part. He is very accurate. Now you look along the keel again at the rabbit with the notches. With the stem and forefoot up in the bow. They are there only temporarily. He double checks his work to make sure that he hasn't made a mistake. Everybody can make a mistake. You remember, he is doing this by himself. He builds the boat by himself at 80 years of age. He is taking a piece of this 4.5-inch oak slab, and he is going to lay out a piece of wood that has a curve in it. With the skill saw, he is now cutting a curve on where he has laid it out on this slab. Now he cannot cut all the way through with the blade. It isn't big enough. So he will cut one side, turn it over, and cut the other side, and it meets where it should. But the unusual thing is that he is actually cutting a curve with a skill saw. In order to locate for the other side, he has turned the slab over. He puts a file, not a file, a hacksaw blade in there to position the template, and he traces it on the other side of the slab. And when he has cut it with the skill saw, the piece falls out. That's how accurate it is. Every piece of wood that Gus cuts out in building a boat, he planes down smooth, because he feels or thinks that the finish that comes from a saw is not smooth enough. So here he uses a plane to smooth that off. There you have the keel on the bottom with the forefoot in place, and what they call ribbands, which are strips of wood that he nails onto the stern, the stem, and the ribs, or rather onto the moles. And that will form the shape that the ribs will be when he builds the boat. You are looking at the keel, at the rabbet with the notches, the ribbands, which are pieces of wood that hold those forms together. You saw him make those forms in the lofting process, beginning. There you have the horn timber that he cut out with the skill saw on a curve. That is the transom of the boat, the stern of the boat. In other words, the frame or the backbone of the boat has been made and put together now. The next step is to put the ribs into the boat so the planking can go on. On this beautiful day, as you see the ferry going out from the island to the mainland on Sands Cove of Vinalhaven, you will now see the process of bending in the ribs. Each rib is split down to about 6 or 8 inches of one end. That means that when he puts it into the boat, or into the boat that is being built, it will bend easier. This is a lobster boat that Gus has built. Notice at a slow speed how level it rides in the water. That is a characteristic of all Gus's boats. Here he comes in, the boat is coming in at a faster speed. It is still level. He builds a very fast boat, and Gus is admiring it. He always likes to see his boats when they are moving around. They are pretty. That's a 32-foot lobster boat. The process of timbering out involves cooking the oak in salt water, the ribs, the oak stock for the ribs. It cooks there 40 minutes. And when that comes out of there, it is very hot. It is steaming. The reason he cooks it is so that he can bend it. It's almost like rubber. The man, when he takes it out of the cooker there, has 5 minutes to get it to Gus, who is inside the frame of the boat. And Gus takes that raw oak, which has been steamed, walks it up on the inside of the ribbands into position. And if I were there not taking the movie, I in turn would clamp that as that man is doing there. Each rib is done this way. He actually walks it up on the inside of the boat into position, and it is clamped. If he is not able to get it into the right position in 5 minutes, it goes back into the cooker so that it will soften up again. It has to be soft, otherwise you would not be able to bend oak like that. As I say, there are 86 ribs on this boat. And when I have done timbering out with Gus, we would do half of them in the morning and half of them in the afternoon. But it so happens today there are lots of helpers around, and they are there with the clamps, and as a result, he did all 86 ribs in the morning. Gus does all the work. He was very tired, whereas when he and I do it all day to do it, it doesn't take as much out of him. He is walking that oak for the rib right up into position where it is clamped. It will cool down about 10 to 15 minutes, and then he nails them in position. So he doesn't have much time to do this work. Again, he positions the oak from the cooker into the slot that was cut in the rabbet on the keel and walks it up on the inside of the boat on the ribbands into position. As I repeat, Gus does all the work. He has to walk on it, and at 80 years of age, it is remarkable that he can do it. But he loves boat building. Again, cooking with it's actually a big pipe blocked off on one end with a roaring fire underneath, and salt water, we just take it right out of the Cove, and they cook in there for 40 minutes. And when they come out, they are soft. That's a spare supply of salt water in that bucket. You have to replenish it all the time because it boils over. I enjoy this process of timbering out and cooking it. To me, it smells like apples cooking. Again, the keel showing the notches with the oak ribs in there. Each rib is 1 inch by 2 inch, or every so often they're 1 inch by 3. When they're 1 inch by 3, he butts the planks so that he can nail 2 planks to that particular rib. There is Gus standing inside the boat waiting for another oak coming from the rib, coming from the cooker, and he will position it in the notch into position so that they can, up in the bow, they can actually clamp it. Here is the boat, the frame of the boat, the stern post, the keel with the ribs in place. The shaft is on there, and he has drilled for the shaft and put on the stuffing box. Now Gus goes to each rib and uses an adze to smooth that off so that it does not project over the keel. He wants a smooth surface for that first plank. Here he's using the adze to shave it off. He is very clever with this adze. It is important that it not project over the side of the rabbet, because if it did, it would not, the planking would not run against the keel, and that is important. It takes a very skilled person to use that adze. Then after he has used the adze, he smooths it off with the sander, just to make sure that it blends in as it should. Each rib is on 9-inch center. Now Gus is going to fasten the oak rib to the keel. He drills 2 holes for the anchor fast nail. He countersinks it for the head of the nail. Then he drives the nail in. It's an anchor fast, which is a bronze, so that it won't rust. Now, excuse me, on this he is not using anchor fast, he is using a galvanized. And then he uses a punch to set the nail's head below the surface. I am wrong. On the ribs, he uses 2 galvanized nails. The boat is fastened with anchor fast nails, but on the ribs where it fits into the keel here, he uses galvanized. Gus has put on the first plank called the garboard plank. It is a very tricky one. It has 2 twists in it. He did not want to have me film it. He told me to go out lobstering, which I did. He gets nervous when there's somebody around, so that when I came back it was all done and I could continue with the movie making. But it has a double twist in it, very tricky, and he could split the plank and he didn't want to do it. Here you look at the stem on the right there, the forefoot, and the keel. This is a plank that he is going to cut out with the skill saw, and so that he can put it onto the boat. I will show you at a later time here how he actually lays out the plank. Looking on the inside, you see how each rib fits into the notch. That is important. This is a month and a half after he started the boat that he's going to do the planking. Now Gus stacks his cedar, which is green, up on a rack so he can look at it to see which plank he wants, what rough piece of wood he wants. He knows in his own mind it has to be a certain width and a certain length. And rather than pile them on the ground, when he stacks them up against a rack there, he can pick out the one he wants. The cedar is quite light. Native cedar. It has many knots in it. As long as the knots are tight, he can use it. Here Gus measures down to a plank that he has put on there because he has to be careful that he has the right number of planks going in. And when he measures, if he has to put 5 more planks in or 10 more planks, 10 planks, each plank would be 5 inches. That way he makes the side of the boat, the planking, look very good. He takes this rough piece of wood that he brought in, the cedar from outside, braces it against the boat, and then clamps it because there's actually a twist. He is now going to do the process of scribing the plank so that he can lay it out and cut it. Notice there is an opening between the plank that is already on the boat and that rough piece that he has brought in from the yard. That opening is what he has to get rid of. And by using a compass with a pencil, a metal point, he draws a line on the new or the rough piece of cedar. That line is one side of the new plank. He knows that if he takes that much off the rough wood, then the plank will be the right width to close up that hole or that space. Then if he knows the plank is 5 inches wide, all he has to do is measure 5 inches from that line, and that will be the plank. Here you see the rough plank that Gus brought in from outside. He has it on a couple of horses, and he is putting a batten onto it, nailing it on, tacking it on, so that he can have a straight line. When he traces that line, it might not be quite straight. So using a batten, which is a very special piece of wood, and it's straight grain, it could either be 3/8 or 1/2 inch thick, and it has to bend the hard way. In other words, the width of it has to bend against it. So he tacks that into position on the line and traces that batten. Then he knows he will have a straight line rather than the line that he drew on the boat itself when he was tracing from the finished plank. That he knows is a straight line. That is, it doesn't have a lot of ripples in it. Then he knows if the plank is 5 inches wide, he moves the batten over 5 inches, and he will trace the line the same way. And in between the lines is the finished plank that is going to go on to the boat. Again, using his skill saw, without cutting the cable, he cuts out the edge of the plank that will go on to the boat. This is 1 inch cedar, so it isn't too hard to cut it. That is the plank that is ready to go onto the boat. However, as I mentioned before, every time Gus cuts a piece of wood with a saw, he planes it off smooth to make sure that it is nice and flat. Now, when he planes a plank, he makes one square. He planes the flat surface square to the side. On the other side, he planes it on an angle, makes a bevel. That is where the caulking is going to go. This is on the transom or the stern of the boat. Gus is filing down the bottom plank of the transom to make sure that it is absolutely smooth. Then he clamps up a rough piece of wood and slides up the plank that he has just laid out into it. That way, he does not have to have another man hold the plank for him. Then he clamps the forward end of it, and there is a twist in the boat. He taps it down into position so that it is a tight fit, and to take care of the twist, he makes a little gadget there with a piece of wood and twists the oak, or rather the cedar plank, close and into position. He uses a wedge to tap it down close against the plank that is already on the boat. Now he is drilling through the cedar into the oak rib and fastening it with 2 anchor fasts. Gus is left-handed, as you can see. Again, he uses a punch to set the head of the nail down below the surface. It is very important that each plank be as tight to the next one as possible. That's why he uses a wedge to actually force it down to make a tight fit. He makes his own drills. Later on, I will show you how he makes them. He figures if he makes them and he breaks it, then it's a lot cheaper than going out and buying a new drill. There is the half model that he had in the very beginning when he was lofting, holding it against the hull before he puts the planks on. He has a few planks down at the bottom. You'll notice some of those planks up near the bow are black. That's because there's a twist in the cedar. And what he did was he put them into this cooking pot out there to soften them up so that they would pull in easily, just so that it would not crack. Here is the hull of the boat, practically complete except for the top plank or strake. This is the most important plank or strake in the boat because it determines what the boat looks like. He is now sanding the side of the boat to finish it. Notice he is going only in one direction with the sander. If you go in the wrong direction against the grain of the wood, it would be a very poor, rough job. So you'll have to be careful and go with the grain all the time. He is now going to caulk between each plank. This is old-style caulking cotton with 5 strands, and he is pulling it apart because he only wants to put one strand in between each plank. There is a special tool, caulking iron, for tapping the caulk into position, the cotton into position. Now, Gus is left-handed, so he is using a mallet. This is a caulking mallet. He doesn't like to use it because it hurts his ears, and normally he uses just a wooden mallet. But most caulkers, people that do nothing but caulking boats, they use that caulking mallet. It is a special one that when the cotton hits the bottom of the groove in there, he can tell from the sound of the caulking mallet that the cotton has bottomed. But as I say, because Gus has a hearing aid, he does not want the sound to hurt his ear. It isn't too pleasant. Now, if the groove between each plank is not wide enough, Gus has made up a special little tool out of a hammer handle into a shape like a V, and he wedges that in there, runs it back and forth to open up the space there in between the planks where the cotton is going to go when he caulks it. It's just a little gadget he made. Now, the process of actually starting the cotton in there, the strand of cotton, he loops it. It goes back maybe 6 or 8 inches and taps it in there with the caulking iron temporarily because he doesn't want to have it hanging down. It's just temporarily put into position. Then he goes back and he actually uses the caulking iron and the caulking mallet to drive the cotton in there. Of course, the caulking is in there so the boat will not sink If the water went in, the boat wouldn't stay afloat too long. The normal practice when a boat is caulked is not to leave the boat with the caulking, the cotton in there overnight. You generally paint it, or what they call paying out. That is the caulking hammer or cotton mallet that Gus used. As I say, he is not too fond of it. He has yet to put the top plank on there, called the strake. At the end of each plank where he has caulked, he leaves the cotton hanging out so he'll know he's done it. The master builder stands back and looks at the boat from a distance, the hull, I should say, and he will decide whether that top ribband there is in the right position. Here he is not too happy in the stern. He thinks the plank should come up a little bit, and he stands back and eyes it. Only a professional boat builder can do this. That determines the shape of the boat, the view of the boat from a distance, and it is important. He clamps on what I call a little helper, which is made out of wood, and he can slide his plank into that, rather than to have somebody holding up the other end. The hull is now complete. The bottom has been red-leaded, and Gus is working on the inside of the boat. June, this is about a month and a half, 2.5 months since he started. That's the stem or the bow of the boat, and Gus is putting in the cockpit of the boat now. That is known as the ceiling that he is putting into the side of the boat. In other words, the cockpit is where the man will work, and you don't want to have anything fall into the ribs. That is the planers. He generally makes his own planers. He buys the blade. The handles probably come from old saws. He uses a very hard wood on those planers. Or planes, I should say. You are now looking at the inside of the boat after it has been planked. Those are the timbers, the frames that hold up the cockpit. Those are the frames down inside the boat that hold the two sides together. It braces the sides of the planking. It has been notched out for the shaft for the motor. July 7th, it's about 3 months later, he has progressed this much more, and this is the new owner of the boat. He has decided to caulk the deck. He is pulling the strands apart. Now what he is going to do is caulk what they call the washboard. It is a slightly different process than what Gus did when he was planking the sides. He uses a different tool that you will see. It's much easier to do it instead of using... He uses like a pie cutter or something like that. It's a handle with a little steel roll on it, and he just forces that cotton into the groove. of the washboard, which is the deck next to the cockpit. Rather than to use a caulking iron, he can roll that in there into position. August 15th, Gus is very well along on the boat. The owner has painted it, and they are now waiting for the shaft. It is because the engine is put a little further forward than most boats. The shaft is an extra long one, and they had to wait for it to come over from the mainland. This is called the sheathing on the side. This is where, when they haul the lobster pots, they bounce off that. They don't want to have it bounce off the side of the boat, so they put in these oak strips. And the lobster pots, when they're hauled out, rub against that. The boat is now ready for launching. It is painted, the bottom is painted, the top sides are painted, and Gus has raised the cradle up so that he could put rollers underneath it and roll it out the big doors of the boat shop and launch it. It is on the cradle for launching. This is a special cradle so that when it gets into the water, he can pull it back up into the shop again and use it for another boat. There is the shaft, the brown shaft, the extra long one they had to wait for. I'm standing now in the cockpit of the lobster boat, and down in the cuddy or the house or the cabin is the motor, a Ford V8. It is going to be a dry exhaust system with two pipes going up, and undoubtedly he won't bother to put mufflers onto it. The lobstermen claim they can get more power out of a dry exhaust system rather than to put mufflers. They can go faster. The brand new propeller, all polished up, next to the stuffing box and the keel. On this particular occasion, I had brought my lobster boat to Maine from Connecticut, and there it is. As you can see, all Gus's boats basically look the same. The Tammi is now rolling out of the boat shop slowly, and Gus has to be careful that it goes slowly, because if it got away from him, it would smash up. He's using a block and falls to slowly let it out on rollers. The cradle is rolling out. The boat is on the cradle. He is waiting for a high tide that will float it off the cradle. He's very careful to make sure that it doesn't go too fast. If it gets away from him, as I say, it could damage the boat. Gus builds, or could build, about 3 boats a year by himself, although he needed somebody to timber out with, but he basically built the boat by himself. That is the 34-foot Tammi, all set to go, waiting for the tide. It is about a 12-foot tide in Maine. It has come up, and now the boat slides out with the cradle. The only thing is that the boat would not get off the cradle. It didn't float free of the cradle. So another lobsterman in a boat that Gus built came alongside, and he is pulling it off the cradle. There the Tammi is sliding off the cradle now as the other boat pulls it out. And Gus will pull that cradle back into the boat shop again and use it for another boat. It's a special launching cradle. He doesn't build on that. Floating free to start a life as a lobster boat. And so, as the day ends, the sunset, the Tammi is pulled over to a dock where additional items will be put onto it.